All right. Um, we're now in Unit 4, which is the first unit of our second semester. And Unit 4 is Forming a Nation. We have now laid the foundation of the Constitution, and the Constitution has been adopted. And now we're going to go through the first 5 administrations of the United States. And we're going to be looking at first President Washington. George Washington was, as we'll see in a video here in a little bit, a beloved figure that had led us to victory over England. And it was a fairly, not even fairly, it was completely unanimous decision or belief that he would be the president. And he was elected in kind of a unique situation that we'll talk more about here in a little bit. But when Washington is first elected as president, he knew that the United States was not only a small and weak military, but that we were pretty small and weak as a nation. We were young. We were the wimpy kid on the block, and that we should probably be very careful about getting involved in foreign affairs, and we should be focused on ourselves and stay to ourselves. And that will be something that he will try to stress to the nation when during his presidency and at the end of his presidency. We are going to try this experiment of having a government based on the Republican, the belief that the Republican rule, that the group and the people were going to run the nation, not a monarch or not a line of people of the elite ruling class, but the people themselves are going to run the government, something that had not been tried ever before on this kind of a scale. So every decision that Washington and his administration will be made will be a brand new one, and it'll be a first every single time they do it. Some of the problems that in the direction that Washington's going to direct the new nation, its government, is that we don't have anything in place. So Washington one night in discussion with some of his friends said, I really probably need some help here. And I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. The founders had passed an act in 1789 called the Judiciary Act. And this Judiciary Act established that the judiciary power of the government would have the final say on ruling over whether or not something was legal. Remember, the executive branch enforces laws, the legislative branch makes laws, and the judiciary branch judges laws. So the Judiciary Act of 1789, underneath Washington's administration, set up for the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has the right to be the final say on all judiciary matters from lower courts. And that they made a progression that you would go from a state to a federal court, from a federal court to potentially to the Supreme Court to hear whether or not something was legal or not. This law allowed for state courts' decisions to be appealed to the federal court. And if you remember, one of the biggest concerns of why we needed to have a stronger central government and the Constitution was that we would have conflicts between people living in different states, and there was no one overseeing who was going to get their side heard and or looked at and ruled in. And so now with a central government, you'll have a central government overruling the states themselves. Washington, as I mentioned just a little bit ago, is seeing that if this is going to be run by the people, I need to have help. I'm not going to play the role of the king and make all decisions. So he sets up people that will be specifically responsible for certain areas. Department of State is going to run all the national affairs for the federal government. Then the Department of War, which will be changed later on to the Department of Defense, will be responsible for training and equipping the nation with a military to protect it. And then the Department of Treasury is responsible for all monetary money, making money policies and things like that to help him run his administration. These are crucial because it sets up an orderly, fashioned system that upcoming administrations can look to decide how they will make rules and how they will follow in the steps of Washington and other administrations, so that it sets a precedent for future administrations that come into power. One of the very first things that Washington realized is that he needed to hire very, very competent people. And if you have good leadership and you have good people that oversees the power of a company or a government, then your chances of success are much higher. And he hires two of these guys. The guy that he puts in charge of the Department of Treasury is a guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton, a very, very smart person. And then the guy that he puts in charge of the Department of State will be Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is famous for the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton, he's the Department of Treasury. He's overseeing all the money, and he wants to have a strong central government. He believes that you've got to have a central government that's going to lead the other states. If you don't, we're all loosely tied together, and he doesn't think we're going to last. And he believes that the government itself should be led by educated, rich, upper class groups of citizens. That's going to be the Federalist Party. They're going to say you go to a doctor, and you go to a doctor who's been trained and is very, very competent, has been trained in all the proper procedures and has done well for himself. And that's why you would go to a doctor. You wouldn't just go to anybody to have something done to you medically. We don't want the common folk making decisions. And Jefferson, on the other side, though, he is one that really distrusts the central government. And he doesn't trust the rich. He thinks that the rich and the central government is self-serving, that they're always going to take care of themselves. So he wants a strong local and state government, and it should be ruled by popular vote. He's going to be part of what will become the Democratic Republican Party. Initially, it was called a Republican. It has no ties to the Republican Party today, but it then becomes the Democratic Republican Party. Hamilton will be the Federalist Party. Hamilton sets up, he's a smart guy, and Hamilton sets up what's called the Bank of the United States. And the Bank of the Federal United States will have the federal government will be responsible for making all the paper money. So you don't have different states having their own state money, but you'll have a government that has one source of money, and they're going to be responsible, the Department of Treasury, and Hamilton says, for waging taxes. And it's also going to take over the debt. So he's going to say, hey, states cannot afford to pay back this massive debt from the Revolutionary War. We'll take that underneath the national government. And the nation will oversee the money that we're going to issue out, and how we will regulate that, and how we will set up taxes. There's a lot of pushback against Hamilton because Hamilton wants a strong central government. And again, Jefferson does not want that. Jefferson is saying, where in the Constitution does it say that you have the power to make this? And this is going to set up for something that's viewed very much today. You have the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Those are the people that say, what was the intent of our founders? Don't say you're just going to change it. And then you have what's called the loose interpretation. And the loose interpretation is going to be those that say, hey, the document and what the framers felt changes. It's a living, breathing document, and it changes over time. And that sounds really good. But the strict constructionist would say, wait a minute, the framers never wanted to have us to be able to assume certain responsibilities. So if you want to do that, there's a line where you make laws where you can do something, but don't allow people to just interpret the Constitution any way they want. Make it literally read what it says, and then if you don't like something, change it. That's going to lead to us coming about what's called the elastic clause. And the elastic clause is in the first article of the Constitution, so it's about the legislative branch, and it's underneath Clause 8. And it says Congress can do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out their powers. So if we say Congress has the power to have a military, then Congress has the power, if it's to have a military, then to wage taxes to fund the military, because that's necessary to have a military. You can't have a military without raising taxes for it. So let's take a quick break here and look at the elastic clause. Okay, now we go into one of the big problems that Washington will run into, and that's political parties. And you're not going to believe this, but our political party base system, two-party system, has been in place since George Washington was president. So you have Hamilton, who is a Federalist, strong central government, and then you have Jefferson, who is this Democrat Republican, strong local guy, and the conflict between the two becomes, and their followers become so intense during Washington's second term that it threatens to split America. Now, we think today that the differences we see between Republicans and Democrats are so unique. Yet you look back to the very first administration, and we had some of these very same differences. So over the time of America, and we've had this happen throughout America. Glaring examples of this is the Civil War, where you have splits between groups and parties. And you've had it throughout the 20th century and now in the new millennium. So this is not new for America to have differences between groups. The major issue that came between the two parties was the size and power of the federal government in comparison to the size of the state and local government. Again, Federalists want a strong central government, and they do believe in a state government, but they want a strong central government. Democrat Republican says, no, we're not very much into a strong central government, but we believe all state and local governments should have the majority of the power. Well, that's an ongoing discussion that we have to this day. Who should be overruling, for example, the idea of education in our system? Is this something that the federal government should regulate, or should it be handled on a state/local level? And that's a debate that is ongoing. But that split that we had caused Washington to become very weary. One more time, that the Federalists are a strong central government, the Democrat Republican are a strong local government, and the two-party system is established all the way back into Washington. So in this last election, we saw a rather unique situation with Bernie Sanders and an independent party that almost won the Democratic nomination. He didn't. He ended up losing, but he gained a lot of support and got a lot farther than anybody has seen. We have not seen someone outside of the Democrat Republican, and these two parties have evolved. The Democratic and Republican Party will be the grandfather to the Democratic Party. And you're seeing these two, but it's always been two groups. It's never been more than that. Finally, I want to just go over one of the big things that threatened our government early on, and that was what was called the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion was where the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, passed what's called an federal excise tax. An excise tax, another name for an excise tax, is a sin tax. And usually a sin tax is placed on things like cigarettes, alcohol, gasoline, and it's what we did here was done off of the production of whiskey. We had frontiersmen out there in the Appalachian Mountains that were producing corn, but corn was not easily transported back to the East Coast. So instead of transporting corn, the farmers would make it into whiskey. Whiskey was and always has been a very valued commodity. Hamilton saw that people wanted whiskey, and he put a tax on the production of whiskey. Well, a lot of these farmers said this is an unfair and excessive tax that was put on us, and so they refused to pay the tax. They refused, and they threatened to leave the Union, to leave the United States and form their own government. Well, that can't happen. So Washington says, no, that will not be allowed to happen. He calls up 15,000 militiamen, and he goes over the Appalachian Mountains, and he meets these frontiersmen, these farmers, and he crushes the rebellion. And he says, no, that's not going to be allowed. And what that did is this act by the federal government confirms that the federal government has the power to raise not only taxes on its people, but that in fact they are the final authority on all domestic affairs. So the Whiskey Rebellion again, and the showdown between do they have to follow federal law? And this is a precedence where we say yes, when there is a law passed at the federal level, you do have to enforce it, and they have the right, and you do have to follow it. And we'll stop there, and we'll jump back in a little bit later on this. So there you go.